everybody is here and we are right on time. Good morning, everybody. I'm sure we will have people joining us as we go along. Good morning. My name is Matimba Changala, and I will be presenting and moderating, actually not presenting, moderating on behalf of the Charter Cities Institute this morning. We have a very rich um, list of participants and presenters today. We're very excited to hear from all of them. Not to waste any time at all, because we want to hear more from them than we want to hear from myself. We'll just get straight into it. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Shuaib Lwasa, and he is a professor of urban resilience and global development at the Institute, at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. Professor Lwasa is also the founding coordinator for the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University, investigating urban transitions and resilience in global South cities. He focuses on urban development challenges, actionable, scalable, innovative, and equitable solutions around climate adaptation and resilience for low-income urban populations. He served on many international scientific assessment panels, including coordinating lead author of IPCC's WG3, AR6 for the Urban Systems chapter, a lead author for the IPCC's Special Report on Land and Climate Change, and a lead author for the IPCC's WGAR5 report on human settlements and spatial planning. He currently serves as an a senior advisory board member on the African Cities Research Consortium at the University of Manchester, and is also affiliated to the University of Cape Town as a principal researcher on adaptation, governance, and transformation, previously also teaching in the Netherlands and in Norway. I think he needs no further introduction. A giant in the field of urban studies. Professor Lwasa, please take us away. You have 15 minutes to give our presentation, to give your presentation to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy, for that introduction. A couple of things you reminded me that I'd forgotten about in terms of Urban Action Lab and the action about scalable, innovative approaches to urban. Well, I just want to talk briefly about what I think about in terms of resilient urban economies and how the cities can play a role in that. And just to upfront let you know that I'm not providing any solutions, but at the end of the talk, perhaps you can think about some of the points that I'll raise and see which ones that can be taken forward in different respects in terms of addressing urban issues. I want to start off by looking at, showing you this image, which is perhaps some of you are familiar with it, or maybe the information about it that it portrays. It's about the distinction between rural and urban labor forces. And the assumption that is behind this image is that the blue line represents the trajectory of why is it playing it? The trajectory of wages in the urban environments, and the red line is the trajectory of wages in rural environments. And this underneath has always informed the distinction of urban from rural, but most importantly also the approaches to urban development and the sort of configuration of national as well as urban economies. But what we are seeing as we'll be going through my presentation is that in Africa, this picture may not actually map on most of the urban economies. If at all, we can disassociate them from the national economies a little bit for purposes of this particular webinar. So that has always informed the urban development and globally, but also most importantly in Africa. And therefore, urban centers remain and continue to be the growth pole centers of economies, where you have expectations in respect to innovation, ideation, incubation, and diffusion of different aspects of economic activity, production, secondary, and tertiary activities. They are also centers of accumulated wealth, technology, and information. And this is also associated with very high consumerism, even when Africa is still largely a low consumer continent in terms of produced or products coming out of manufacturing sector. And Africa is still largely an exportation economy, and urbanization together with poverty can also be described as urbanizing poverty, where you have very marked presence of inequality, spatial injustices. And at the same time, to bring in the political economy lens, centers in many urban centers globally, but also Africa, are also remain to be important nodes of political activity, including political resistance. A big amount of which actually could be related to the discomfortness and the disjunctures in respect to expected roles of the urban and national economies versus the labor force that we have. As we know, many people still describe Africa or continue to describe Africa as a youthful urban youthful population on the continent. And the reality of urban goes actually beyond cities. And I'm deliberately using these two terms here to say that we start off from cities which are jurisdiction, but urban goes beyond cities. And urban is the functionality in space. And part of that space is the complicated multiple layers of different pieces that are put together in building urban, with the expectation that they will seamlessly connect, link up, and then propel economies as growth pole centers. And one important thing I want to add to this is that the urban also is not only physically connected in terms of urban to hinterland and urban to urban within geographical spaces, but they also have distal connections. So these bubbles that you see in this image actually show the city jurisdiction, but the functionality going beyond that jurisdiction to other cities and rural environments, but even cities globally that have distal relations, and where you have something happening in one city that influences what happens in many other cities. When we think about the exportation and importation economies of the globally, but also on the African continent. So the demand for services, the demand for transportation, the demand for products, and the value chains associated with that are very much in the space of shaping urban. And therefore we have to think about that if we're going to come up with any sort of ideas on how to build resilience of the urban. So how are the urban economies shaped from a global perspective? I want to think of them as a network of networks. So cities themselves, from the previous image, are networked, so city of systems or city systems, but cities are also connected globally from hinterlands to distal connections. Cities are important nodes and conveyors of global value chain flows, which it characterizes the export economies, but also import economies. And I just want to again underline that many of the African economies are still exportation economies, and a good number of them are also growing import economies, in the sense that there's a lot of reliance on products coming from outside the continent into the urban centers on the continent of Africa. That has very serious implications in respect to resilience, as perhaps you will be discussing. And here I'm just giving I'm giving you a bit of the flavor in terms of ideas that you can think about again in terms of discussing this notion of building resilient economies. Cities as global nodes for these flows is important, and it's not just about products, it's also services, it's also information, it's also knowledge, sometimes also unwanted flows in terms of the rhetoric of resistance, the movements as we have seen them in different spheres. Cities are the incubation centers, if you will, but also the nodes through which some of these flows happen globally, and they remain very important on the continent in driving its economy. If you zoom a little bit into Africa, I think that Africa portrays it's not a complete, but a largely different reality in terms of urban, in spatial sense, in social cultural configurations. And that is what is commonly referred to as informal, largely. I tend to accept that, but also push back a little bit and say, wait, perhaps that is an emerging sort of urban setup and configuration. And the urban economies in Africa are so different. It's not just about importation and exportation, but there are also a multitude of different other economic activities that are happening that are often obscured by this desire to have a commonality and seamless connection in the networks globally, but also on the continent. I think that within urban centers and economies, there's a lot of creativity, a lot of ingenuity that actually speak a lot to many things. But one of the key aspects that I want to put forward in this seminar is the decentered economy. So in the sense that we sort of loosely delinking from the network, centralized systems and the global value chains, which is, I think, very important. And if you think about it in terms of policy, there's this push to continuously connect African economies through the global value chain, so that they continue to be part of the ecosystem, if you will, of global economy, which is very much related to centralized networks, in the sense you can have hubs of different production or services, and then in those hubs, then you have further distribution flows going to where the demand exists. And this informs global development, this informs urban development, this shapes the urban economies and largely the continental economy as well, if you think of it that way. And the policy direction has always been that the policy solutions and ideas should come from elsewhere or are sought from elsewhere. After, in most cases, the African continent and leadership seeks policy and direction from elsewhere rather than from within, which is good, but at the same time also increases heightens the vulnerability, as I mentioned. And one of the key things that I want to highlight, and it's good that the diversity of the panel, I noticed that there's also going to be a discussion about finance. The financial architecture, if I call it that way, is it's structurally centering global flows and networks. And that means there's control over finance, the mechanism and the architecture somewhere else rather than on the African continent, which is okay, but at the same time, as we shall see, it makes Africa actually more vulnerable in terms of addressing and responding to the perturbations to its economy. And we have seen it. So the outcome of that has been a lock-in. I describe it as a lock-in, and that lock-in can be described as further as a superhighway. So we are on a superhighway, and the gas pedal is being pressed so that we can move fast and sync urban development in the majority world with that urban development in the minority world. I just came across those terminologies recently, and I thought, wow, this is a good way of actually, sort of moving or an alternative description of the global north and the global south, which is nice. So it means that we're actually continuously pressing the gas and staying in the lane, so as business as usual. But we are trying harder. We are trying harder, using the same methods, using the same approaches for economic development and the same approaches for resilience building that are deployed. And we're spending more of the traditional systems, the financial architecture, the way cities are built, the configuration of the export economies, and now the growing import economy on the African continent. So it's try harder, things will change. We're expecting things to change. We're expecting resilience to be built with the same methods that actually has created some of the risks, as I'm going to mention here in the next slide. So what are the risks associated with lock-in? I think that lock-in itself is a systemic risk in the first place, but within that systemic risk, there are quite a number of, you can delay a number of different risks that affect the urban economies and African economy. One is heightened vulnerability of the economies, because a small perturbation can actually have very adverse effects on the economies in Africa because of partly the past dependencies, which is also a risk. So again, going back to centralized networking, global value chains around aid economies, we cannot forget to talk about the aid economy and the role of international organizations by the UN and several others, UNDP and the like, that seem to portray this picture that Africa is in need and has to be aided bilaterally or multilaterally or otherwise. And then the coloniality is associated with that are also going to be very important in terms of, from a very granular level, the language, the practices, but even at a political level, the way the bilateral arrangements are organized, the negotiations, they are often unequal, and African leadership do not have the opportunity to actually present alternatives because they're predetermined and shaped by the colonialities associated with them. And part of that is the development finance trap. I call it a trap because we are trapped and entrapped into the architecture I described that is very much driven by bilateral as well as multilateral relations. And most recently, it's been also mediated by the geopolitics as also another possible accentuating risk to the economies of Africa. So I deliberately put this slide in the middle to try and reflect a little bit on resilience and resilience to what or in what ways. So one of the things that I want to start with is the small perturbations in global systems that I've described can have adverse effects on the urban economies. And part of that could be explained by many things, but one of which is policy changes. So for example, aid policies, which tends to often change every 3 to 5 years, refocusing, dropping some countries, including some countries, either bilaterally or multilaterally, withdrawals. Sometimes they've come abrupt. We've seen that with reasons being given. For example, the refugee crisis in Europe led to a number of EU countries to bilaterally reduce the aid and the development partnership that they had with certain countries. Democracy used as a tool, human rights and geopolitics to say, okay, if you don't do A, B, C, D, then we're not going to give you this grant. And then African economies and countries are pushed in the corner to try and accept some of these conditions to the bilateral relationships that they have. Sociocultural disjuncture. We have generally sort of not African, but multiplicity of different African sociocultural systems that don't seem to align well with some of the emerging sociocultural configurations from the global north. And those are also used as conditions to either withdraw or actually press the gas, the pedal to provide more support and relationship. There's also the long-standing unequitable global trade and relations. The reparations debate, which has been sort of rejuvenated lately, and the continued extractivism of resources from the continent, which speaks a lot to the exploitation economy, and also the increasing natural and human-induced hazards. So these are the technological lock-in, and deeper democracy has a lot to do with how we are either free or unfree from technology. So the transition from age 2G, 3G, 5G, Africa is struggling for transition from 3G to 4G, but now 5G is around the corner, and then perhaps another technology is going to come. And then before we actually get to 4G, another technology will come, and we are locked into that roller coaster of we have to upgrade because our systems are not compatible anymore. So that is a lock-in, and it also affects deeper democracy. It's not about politics of election, it's about the freedom we have as individuals, as a continent. Do we have a choice to say we are not part of this, but we would like to be part of that? And therefore, do we have control over some of the gadgets that we use, including the phones and other things? That is what I describe here as deeper democracy. And therefore, are we resilient enough if something happens to these systems? And we have seen some situations. So I'm not going to go through this loaded slide, but I just want to highlight a few things. Is the timing right to take a truly different approach in terms of decentering, in terms of discussing and going deeper around the practicalities of what deeper democracy means and how we can achieve that? What about changing and transforming institutions in an innovative way? Financial instruments. And on finance, I want to think about this point that has been lingering in my head. Can we mobilize finance of African continent, and can crowdsourcing be a good tool for that? I'm not sure about that, but we haven't tried it. And the capacity for financial muscle on African continents, I think it tends to be underrated, but perhaps there's a potential to think about there. And then resilience building will also require us to think a little bit about the uncertainties, understand where we can, and be able to prepare ourselves for these multiple shocks, which are not just natural hazards. There are these social, biological, but also global value chain and geopolitical risks that hamper our resilience as a continent and the resilience of the economies. And we need, therefore, to take a different approach and transition. If we need to do that, can we exit and go away from the press harder or try harder or business as usual? And what does a truly different approach mean on the economies in terms of building resilience on the African continent? I think, and this is the last slide, that there are opportunities that we can actually grab. And these opportunities have a lot to do with already what is existing, but we can take that as an opportunity to change the way we do things. There's a lot of discussion about disaster risk, climate change, and the responses are associated with that are needed. Is this the game changer? Is it possible to get whatever we can get through the negotiations on climate change, if at all it comes? I'm a bit pessimistic about it, and then plan the utilization in such a way that we spur the economies to think about the decentering, to think about innovation in institutional governance, and to also redesign the financing and amplify local and crowdsourcing from the continent. This issue of net zero targets, sustainable development goals, I'm not very sure how helpful they are. because the MDGs were not helpful to the continent. I'm not sure that SDGs are helpful, but is it an opportunity? Because if the architecture we are locked in is still there, we have to find ways in which we can still utilize it, but balancing it with a truly different approach. I don't know what that means in the moment, because I'm not sure how climate finance is going to be used for economic resilience. If it's going to be used in a way that has already predetermined the log frame through the bilateral or multilateral arrangement, then the resilience is going to be farther down the road in terms of enabling our economies to stand when they actually are affected by perturbations linked to all these global value chains and networks that are happening. And when you come to and zoom into a little bit urban development, I think that urban on Africa still, because it presents and portrays itself in a slightly different way, I think we have to look at the opportunities therein rather than the problems and the missing and the deficits. A lot of effort is still about this is missing, that is lacking. But no, very few people think about, okay, this exists and it can be built up, it can be scaled up, and it can remain non-networked, it can remain micro or meso and not necessarily macro. And those discussions are not going on the way that they should be going on the African continent. And tinkering urban spaces and integrating them with nature is something that I also think about. And that changes a lot of things in respect to moving away from solutions driven, so the policy direction I talked about earlier, to opportunities driven. So what there is in these spaces that can be built upon. Part of that is going to be the network, but perhaps the other part is the unknown or so-called black hole about the opportunities that might exist but are not harnessed, including crowdsourcing for financing, including new jobs that are not manufacturing jobs, to go back to the other trajectories that I showed, including many other things that are related to informality, whether it is housing, whether it's jobs, whether decent jobs, and whether it is pieces of infrastructure, multiplicity of infrastructure. Do they all have to be centralized and networked? Perhaps not. And this, I think, is an opportunity. So that's why I'm saying, can climate finance or any other form of existing much talked about financing and architecture be utilized to change from solutions driven to opportunities driven? And how can we then embrace equity as a one way through which we can glide, if you will, into the transformation and taking a truly different approach? Is equity the answer to, well, not answer, but does it provide a framework? So a lot of people are talking about just transitions, equitable development, leaving no one behind. How do we do that if we are still pressing the gas and trying harder? What about if we embrace the multiple systems that are existing, the technologies? How do we address the deeper democracy in respect to the lock-in and related to technology and this emerging sector that is often, and in many of the discussions and issues are called informality? I think there's some potential that has not yet been harnessed there. Can we seize that opportunity to change things on the urban economy? So as you can see, I've not talked about solutions, but rather the approach is, in my thinking, is let's try to move away a little bit, without necessarily negating it completely, from solutions-driven approaches to opportunities creation approaches. And that can create multiple systems that are partly networked and global, but partly off the network, or what we call off-grid systems in terms of urban development, sanitation, electricity. So if I have a solar panel on my house, I don't have to rely on the grid electricity to be on. So if in Uganda, where I come from, ESCOM is one of the players in the energy. And if ESCOM suffers a problem, that perturbation affects everyone. But if I have a solar panel that is off that grid, then I'm resilient enough. I will still continue working. I will still continue reading at night. I will do whatever I'm doing with that energy. If it is a micro enterprise, it will continue running instead of crying, oh, ESCOM, you're a problem, kick out ESCOM out and things like that. We know what has happened in many countries when you actually have those centralized systems that are very networked. They tend to be very vulnerable. And that vulnerability seems to be, in my opinion, also present in the African continent and the economies. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Prof. Prof, I think, I don't know how resilient I am as a Zimbabwean being forced to put solar panels on my roof, but I mean, we'll get into that conversation later. So essentially, shifting solutions to opportunities and equity. And I'm going to move to Assistant Director, Mr. Patson Phiri, who is the Assistant Director in the Department of Physical Planning under the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development in Lusaka, Zambia. And we've heard that cities are networks of networks. Mr. Phiri, could you tell us a bit more about the work that Lusaka is doing and how we could do better?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll speak from my notes. I did not make a presentation. Yeah, but I think it has been presented. I think it's important that also as Africa, we start looking inwards to our solution so that we may be able to, come up with strategies that really speak to our situation. And I liked what the Prof said about moving from solution-driven strategies to opportunity-driven strategies. In Zambia, we have under the Urban and Regional Planning Act, which is the major policy framework that shapes urbanization and development of cities in Zambia. There is the preparation of what we call integrated development plans. The integrated development plans is a legal framework for urban planning and development, and it does emphasize on preparing, a district, overarching strategy that speaks to spatial planning, local economic development strategies, disaster risk reduction, as well as emphasizing on stakeholder engagement in terms of preparation of this plan. And at national level, we are guided by the National Planning and Budgeting Act, which defines and provides for preparation of national development plans every 5 years. Currently, we are at the 8th National Development Plan, which is basically Zambia's development blueprint with a strong focus on local economic development and job creation. And this, it has been presented, this provides an opportunity for us to ensure that we shape our, developmental trajectory, but also that we provide policy frameworks that is creates resilient economies. In terms of urbanization, currently we have prepared what is called a national urbanization policy, but which is still in draft form. And whose vision is a prosperous, inclusive, and resilient urban settlements. This is the document that will guide, the development of urban centers as well as, cities in the country, so that we make them more prosperous, inclusive, as well as resilient. Like I said, all cities and districts are required actually to prepare what are called integrated development plans, which are instruments or tools that shape or give the direction of development to a city or or a district in general, with emphasis on providing resilience, economic resilience. There's also the national decentralization policy, which policy has been reinvigorated in the recent times. The decentralization policy has been there for a long time, but with the coming of the new government, we saw renewing the commitment to decentralization, because there has been attempts to actually devolve powers and resources to local governments to ensure that development of local economies and the economy in general become very effective, and that the local communities can determine their developmental trajectory by determining, by having enough resources as well as power to do so. So we've seen, the improvement in fiscal decentralization, where we have the intergovernmental fiscal transfers being increased from for instance, more than 500% 2 years ago, and we hoping that when the budget for next year is approved, there is even a more significant increase in the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. But out of these, the most important and significant intergovernmental fiscal transfer is what we're calling the Constituency Development Fund. And CDF in short. So this is a fund that government, transfers to the local authorities to ensure that they determine their own projects. And then there is also a component of empowerment in order to, to steer up local economic activities by, giving grants and loans at local level, and also bursaries towards skills development, vocational training, so that you can create a cadre that is able to, to contribute effectively to economic development at that level, as well as a component on disaster response to ensure that, we strengthen resilience, both in, economic terms, as well as, the just natural disaster that would befallen, including issues relating to or linked to climate change issues. So in conclusion, I would say, the policy framework for building a resilience economy at both national and local level alone is not enough unless there's the citizens and the private sector and other stakeholders play their role, to ensuring that economic development and objectives are met. It's important that all actors are involved, because policy alone is not enough to deliver economic resilience and economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Phiri. And I like how you ended this. Policy is not enough and all actors need to be involved. But I'd like to add an extra layer. All actors need to have the agency in order to be involved, and they need to feel included enough to involve. And part of that inclusion was already alluded to in the keynote, and it's finance, right? So I'm going to switch over to Miss Micheline Savadogo, who is with the African Development Bank. And I'm going to preface this by saying, Professor Lwasa spoke about the development financial trap and shared his concerns on climate financing for economic resilience building, right? And the bank is well placed in understanding the unique financial challenges and barriers that we have. So please, could you run us through what can be done essentially in the 5 minutes that we have with you?
Yes, thank you all. Yes, before I go directly to the financing, I will just give a few overlook of some of barriers to access on the climate finance. As the previous colleague like Prof and Mr. Patson say, we have a couple of barriers like in the country level, the lack of policy that's address directly climate finance. Also, we have a lack of, in terms of, a lack of funding, in terms of national level. Sometimes most of our country don't have a budget line to address climate issue. So, and also a lack of capacity in terms of how to make a bankable project on the climate finance. So for this, some of a solution to overcome those barriers, I just highlight in yellow the main. We need to set a clear policy on the national level, which are addressed on the climate issue. This is important to ensure that we take it in serious. We also need to look for another way to mobilize resources like a private sector to invest in the climate resilience in the city. We also need to have some, professor like said, some cross-cutting between the African country, some bilateral and international collaboration to share lessons and also to capture some best experience for others to address those issues. To come specifically on what African Development Bank has in terms of financing instrument to address the climate issue in urban, we have several financial instruments in the African Development Bank, and the most important that is the African Development Bank board has approved the law for subnational level. So it's possible to African Development Bank to directly loan at the city level. This can also have a very potential to mitigate this lack of resources at the city level. And also in terms of innovative mechanism, last year we have created set alliance for green infrastructure in Africa. This alliance aims to facilitate the financial of green infrastructure. And also we have some, a African Green Bond Program. This also is another way to tackle this lack of urban resilience resources in terms of subnational level. And also we have a thematical trust fund at the African Development Bank. We launched in 2019 the Urban and Municipal Development Fund. So this fund aims to accompany the city in terms of resources. And also the fund work around 3 pillars. We have urban governance, urban planning, and also project preparation facility. I just talked about the lack of bankable projects. So the aim of the fund is also to accompany the city to prepare a very bankable project and also open the window for private sector. And also to accompany the city in terms of planification document preparation. And also you see that the lack of policy in terms of government level is also a main reason for this urban resilience lack. So the fund aims to assist the city to have very planification document at the upstream level, and also to unlock downstream investment to this area, mainly in the urban climate resilience aspects. So I will stop there. I will not go deeply in the fund and other things because time is too short. But maybe I can give more explanation during the Q&A session. Thank you, Matimba. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. We have two banks here, and we'll switch over to the other bank, Afreximbank. And before I switch over to Ms. Changala, I would like to say that if anybody has any questions that they would like, please post them in the Q&A. We will be looking through them and handing them over to our presenters to answer them and moderating them, thus said. So, Ms. Changala, you're on the other side of the bank, the trade side, and we've already heard about the climate smart initiatives that AFDB has. We've heard that AFDB can loan at the city level, and we've heard the challenges from previous speakers, both at local government level and from the policy and academic level. Can you share some strategies around what has worked, right? And what challenges or lock-ins that Afreximbank still sees from this resilience point of view? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks a lot for inviting the bank to this session, webinar. So to begin with, I think that I would like to highlight what the bank is doing in terms of fostering economic growth in the urban areas in Africa, and how we're addressing some of the challenges that have been highlighted so far. So what the bank has done is that in 2028, we established what we call an African Sub-Sovereign Governments Network. And what that is aiming to do is to try and bring economic development at the local level. So basically trying to foster development, trying to engage the African sub-sovereigns, the African regions on the continent to see how best we as a bank can support them. So this is an initiative that we felt and was developed on the understanding of the various challenges that are faced at the local level. And in the subsequent year, in 2022, last year, we went into an MOU with the United Cities and local governments of Africa on the understanding that they're already working in this space. They're working with the local governments, the urban areas, and the different regions, towns, cities in the continent. And we thought that, you know, having our finance background, being a multilateral trade finance institution, that there were synergies that we could explore to try and bring development at the local level. So with that in mind, our initiative is aiming to address, you know, the challenges that I think some of the speakers have highlighted and that you've highlighted through that initiative. So for instance, through that initiative, we're trying to support infrastructure, of course, in the regions. And that, you know, support infrastructure includes roads, rails, bridges, ports, generally various infrastructure. And we're marrying that with other bank products and initiatives that the bank already has to support. So we have an initiative in the bank that supports infrastructure development on the continent. So we're trying to now then bring that to the local level. For instance, we also have a facility that will support specific infrastructure, port infrastructure, building of ships or fleets, various things that might be happening at the local level. In addition to that, we're also supporting manufacturing in these regions. So the initiative is also aimed to see how can we support manufacturing. So as a bank, we have a product that is aimed at developing, for instance, export processing zones, as well as industrial parks. And we're doing that in various countries such as Togo. We're working on establishing similar initiatives in countries such as Kenya. And we're trying to see how do we do what we're doing at the national level as Afreximbank to support manufacturing at the national level and bring it down to the local level. So what we've agreed actually with the United Cities and local governments is that we will try and have a regional focus, pilot some of these initiatives at the regional level and see how best we support. So for instance, we're working with the city of Kisumu to try to work with the counties, the specific counties in Kenya, say Kisumu and the Lake Region block, to see for them to identify their specific development needs. And then as a bank, we will then sit and look at our various products, initiatives to see how best we can support those initiatives that are happening in the counties in Kenya. And then together with United Cities and local governments, we then look at other regions that we can focus on. But that is not to say that because we're focusing on, for this year, we're focusing on Kenya, that we cannot support other regions. We will do that simultaneously, but in terms of the focus and our direct interventions would be on those. But if there are projects in other regions, we are open to that. And as part of that initiative, we organize an annual conference, which we call the African Sub-Sovereign Government Network Conference. We'll be having the next one this year, the third edition, which will be happening at the Intra-African Trade Fair. So we have our biannual Intra-African Trade Fair, which is the AFCFTA marketplace. So it's running from the 9th to the 15th of November. It will be held in Egypt, Cairo. And on the sidelines of that, we're going to have the conference. And the idea of the conference is to bring the various heads, the governors, the premiers, the county heads in all the African regions, mayors into one place and discuss, how best that the sub-sovereigns can be supported. But also we're using that as a platform for them to bring their various development projects. And then together we will bring investors in the room as well as financial institutions and see how best we might be able to support their development projects with the aim, of course, of bringing development at the sub-sovereign level. So we also undertake as part of that. So this is an annual conference, let me just state. So this year to be in the trade fair. So the year that we're having at the trade fair, we hold it on the sidelines of the trade fair. And if it's not happening, if that year doesn't have a trade fair, we then agree with the sub-sovereigns on a host for the next year. In addition to the AFSNet conference, we also support African sub-sovereigns with capacity building, generally, highlighting the bank products initiatives that we have that can support their interventions. But also we work with other institutions. We bring in other experts to be able to highlight, how they could be supported and how they can bring development in their various regions. And we work in collaboration, and like I highlighted, with the United Cities and Local Governments of Africa. They also have a capacity building academy, and together we brainstorm and agree on how we can support the sub-sovereigns as regards capacity building. But also just to highlight before I end that, we do all this under the umbrella of the African Continental Free Trade Area, because we realize that regional integration is key to enhancing trade and investment in these sub-sovereigns, in these urban areas or in these regions. So we work in direct support. Actually, part of our technical team is made up of people from the AFCFTA Secretariat, just to ensure that, and see how we can ensure that what is the trade and investment initiatives that are being fostered or promoted by the African Continental Free Trade Area are also being implemented at the local level. So I'll end there for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. There's a direct question from you that I would like you to address now. There is a question about, There is a question about from Grace Tonga, who is in Zambia, who asks if you would be able to support climate change initiatives in Zambia, since it's not in the region of piloting at the moment. That that was directed to you, Matimba, but I'm also going to throw it to Micheline very briefly. Yes or no?
Yes. So yes, and there are a few climate related projects that the bank is implementing. For instance, we are supporting the battery value chain in Zambia. Actually, this is a special economic zone that we're establishing between DRC and Zambia for the establishment of batteries to support the development of electric vehicles, because we understand that the two regions have the raw materials to be able to support that industry. And, with the move to cleaner energy and ending fossil fuels and having more electric cars, we see that as an initiative that we can support as a trade finance bank, which is already supporting specialized industries of that nature. So the answer is yes, and we are actually doing a few activities towards that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move over to Samuel. Mr. Samuel Njuguna is with UN Habitat in Nairobi. And we need to understand a bit more. We've been hearing about policy being a challenge multiple times in this webinar, but we also know that policy implementation is a challenge. And with your expertise in legislature and governance, what changes are needed to enhance urban challenges faced by African cities today? Could you take us through that?
Thank you, Mandipa. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see my presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel Njuguna from UN Habitat, and I work on improving legal and institutional processes for sustainable outcomes. I am really glad to be part of this discussion today and for the invitation to discuss building resilient cities for the future. And as Mandipa has mentioned, my intervention will focus on the role of regulatory and governance frameworks for urban climate resilience. So let's quickly get into it because of the time allocated. I hope my slides are moving very well. So the starting point, and I don't want to reiterate this because it has been captured by the speakers before me, but cities are responsible for over 70% of global emissions. And what we're seeing now is that temperatures are 10 degrees higher than rural areas. And then one key issue, and I think Professor highlighted very well, is that climate change is disproportionately affecting the urban poor. including the billions who are living in vulnerable hotspots and informal settlements. So globally, I can say that there's a growing awareness of the importance of cities to take action urgently. So as UN Habitat, or rather UN Habitat, recognizes legislation and governance as key drivers of change in cities, especially in promoting climate resilience. We have developed several tools to support this, and key among them is the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. The toolkit was developed in 2016 by the Commonwealth Secretariat, UNEP, and the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat as an innovative online tool designed to help countries establish legal frameworks that are necessary for the effective domestic implementation of the Paris Agreement. So as UN Habitat, we came in 2018 to develop a specific module for this toolkit, which is the urban law module, which does recognize the close nexus between urbanization and climate change. As you can see from the screen, the module is comprised of 5 sections, or what I call indicators. So we have the governance framework for urban and climate planning. We also look at urban and territorial planning in relation to climate change. We also have 2 key aspects on urban planning and design for both adaptation and mitigation. And as what has been tackled, I think, very well in this discussion is the climate finance and looking at it from the urban planning perspective. So each section of this online tool includes specific questions to guide the user in terms of assessing the legal and policy landscape in your given country or city context. And what we found useful is that we developed a companion guide to help users navigate through and use the online version of the toolkit. And the companion guide provides a nice narrative description and also exemplary legal provisions. So just to put this into practice, it might sound complicated, but I just want to show in the next slide how this potentially looks like. So just to look at one of the indicators, which is the governance framework for urban and climate planning, I was not meant to go into details on this slide because of time, but the aim is to give you a flavor into this indicator. So you can see that there's an exemplary legal provision from the Philippines Climate Change Act of 2009 as a best practice on multi-level climate action. And then the other indicators as enabling governance conditions, such as participatory and informed decision-making, which is part of sound environmental governance. And I think the speakers, especially Mr. Patson, mentioned the need to empower local authorities with the fiscal and jurisdictional capacities to tackle climate change as the closest institution to the people and have local knowledge. So these are the indicators, and then they are complemented by exemplary legal provisions. So in a situation where your city or country identifies a gap in their legal landscape on any specific indicator, you'll be able to see how that has been tackled in different jurisdictions. So I'll move on swiftly to some success stories. And just to say that we've piloted the urban law module in over 8 countries now: Colombia, India, Malawi, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Tajikistan, Oman, Comoros, etc. And the biggest impact has been the fact that we've influenced key considerations from science and international best practices into legislation and governance frameworks. And currently what we're seeing, for example, is that Zimbabwe is developing the first Climate Change Act based on the outcomes of our legal assessment. And I believe they will have a powerful legal instrument to successfully tackle climate change related issues. So I think the issue of multi-level climate action has been highlighted very well in these discussions, including also from the aspects of finance and the aspects of policy and legislation. So just to say, it has been really highlighted, especially in the Glasgow Climate Pact of 2021. And it's based on this that we developed the guide, multi-level governance for effective climate action in the Global South, to basically offer an understanding on how to improve horizontal and vertical coordination among different levels of government, as well as leveraging the contributions of non-state actors to enhance resilience and ensure that development takes place in climate-friendly ways. So apart from this normative side and the kind of explanatory notes and everything else, we've included in this toolkit practical case studies from my experiences in implementing the Urban Low Emission Development Strategies project in partnership with ICLEI from 2017 to 2021. So the examples from different countries such as Brazil, Rwanda, South Africa, etc. And as you see from the screen, I do want to go into very much detail that those enabling governance conditions for climate action that are discussed in the tool. But out of all this, I would like to highlight political will, especially since it has proven to be quite critical in all aspects. And just to mention that at least we're seeing some signs, as even Professor was saying, we don't have the solutions, but just to show you some of the signs that we're seeing coming up and that are very useful. So for example, in last year's COP27, we had the first iteration of the ministerial meeting on urbanization and climate change, which really marked a significant step towards achieving vertical alignment in climate action. So the meeting did highlight or emphasize the critical role of cities in addressing the climate crisis through multi-level climate action. And the second iteration will take place during this year's COP28 on 6th December, and we're really looking forward for positive action plan for our cities. So I think this is my last slide, just to highlight that we are about to launch end of this month an e-learning module on law and climate change, aimed at building the capacity of national and local governments and other stakeholders on the importance of urban law and governance in promoting low carbon, green, resilient, and sustainable urban development. So for the users who will be hopefully everyone present in this discussion, is that we will have interactive features such as videos, flip cards. We also have a forum that will facilitate peer-to-peer learning and exchange among users, given that we have different perspectives and different engagements and different challenges in our cities and countries. And just to give you a snapshot in terms of how the online module looks like. So module 1 will tackle what you see on the screen. What is climate change? How is this being addressed by the international community? And then module 2 will look in or zoom in into climate change and intersecting vulnerabilities in cities. Module 3 and 4 is dedicated to expand or expound on our urban law module on the law and climate change toolkit and how this tool is meant to be implemented. And then module 5 will have a closing and some final quiz, but the quizzes are also part of the different modules that I've mentioned before. So I will stop there and say thank you. And for interest, I'll be sharing these materials on the chat, and I'm handing over to Mandipa for the rest. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I love being in a room where I'm not the smartest. I'm now learning that my country is developing a climate change act, and I'm very proud. And I hope there's political will to implement it, but you know, we shall see. I'm going to hand over to our last presenter and preface her presentation by saying, you know, we've heard during the presentations that resilience is all-encompassing and it has many moving parts. As Mr. Njuguna just noted, you know, participatory governance, political will, and capacity building is needed to make sure all of this happens. And it was also noted by Mr. Patson Phiri, amongst others. So Eva, I'm going to ask you, what key factors do you believe are crucial for success, for successful urban development in Africa, and how can they be implemented effectively? There's questions around this in the chat as well, around special economic zones, if you want to speak to that as well. So please take it away in the 5 minutes that you have. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be quick. Yeah, I would just like to reiterate what was just said, right? Good institutions and crucially multi-scalar social, economic, legal governance is important for empowering cities to build resilience, generate economic growth, and then have those cascading returns for resilience for the region, the countries as a whole. And with that, I think, you know, being at the Charter Cities Institute, we see Charter Cities as one valuable tool for implementing those changes. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. So just for those who aren't very familiar, charter cities are essentially new cities with new rules, and you can think of them as was previously mentioned, as more comprehensive special economic zones. And so the basic idea is that by devolving governance authority to local officials, you can improve responsiveness, improve administrative practices, and implement more business-friendly kind of commercial regulations. And this can help prevent premature load there and increase capacity and lead to better outcomes. And we advocate for a public-private partnership governance model. I won't get too into that because it can be a bit nitty-gritty and we're running low on time. But if you're interested, definitely reach out and I'm happy to talk more about it. But the overarching vision is that by empowering new cities with good governance, we can generate sustainable shared prosperity. And so we see charter cities not only, helping to support good institutions, but also contributing to strategically directing urbanization to less climate-prone areas, and also obviously generating the economic growth and shared prosperity necessary for resilience. So to this first point, of course, historically cities have proliferated along rivers, along coastlines, because that's useful for trading, but this also makes cities particularly vulnerable to flooding, storm surges, sea level rise. And you can see in this image here, countries in red are experiencing urban expansion in flood zones that's over 50% higher than expansion in non-flood zones. And so we think that by creating new cities or building out secondary and tertiary cities, it's possible to not only direct households to less climate vulnerable areas, but it also expands the location options available. Because families shouldn't have to choose between living somewhere with high climate vulnerability and economic opportunity. So especially where there's kind of unbalanced urban growth or one kind of mega city and underinvestment in secondary and tertiary cities, we think that providing alternatives is a really powerful adaptation tool. And building new cities can also help avoid large-scale reactive relocation in the future as climate change impacts are more harshly felt. So second, the big point here, the charter cities is all about it, is that sound institutions are essential for resilience, right? Managing rapid urbanization in the face of climate change requires capacity, coordination, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. And we think charter cities can really help alleviate some of these capacity constraints. For example, I'll just talk to this first point, land use and urban planning. So by devolving authority for keeping cadastral records, doing business titling, property titling, you can create kind of a more robust, responsive land administration system that is capable of doing disaster preparedness, compensation for loss after shocks, capable of managing expansion, and also, providing those titles and tenure security that are necessary for households to build micro level resilience, right? Because again, it's the multi-scalarity of resilience. And so, good land administration is one example of also improving economic governance. And you can see here that there's a pretty strong correlation between a good economic governance and vulnerability to climate change. And this is really because good economic governance can create a business environment that's more conducive to, for example, attracting investment and finance for climate conscious infrastructure projects or other mitigation adaptation initiatives. But crucially, it also lays the foundation for economic growth. And this can really be considered the tide that lifts all boats, right? It's important for reducing vulnerability to climate change because it could create more revenue for investment, like I previously said, but also can help increase capacity to prepare and respond to disaster. Especially as climate change really changes the comparative advantage of regions, it's important to have sustainable urbanization that can help diversify and compensate the losses for, say, a declining agricultural sector. And here in this map, you can see that this will be more important for some regions than others, right? Not all countries will be equally impacted by climate change, but I mean, under a 4-degree scenario of global warming, pretty substantial decreases in GDP per capita at the current, game as usual. So creating new opportunities through urbanization is crucial, not only for macro level economic growth, but also for individual households, right? By providing alternate employment opportunities, households can save, smooth consumption, continue to invest in education, and really have more capacity to absorb and adapt to shocks. It also promotes innovation and experimentation with green technologies. Of course, urbanization leads to experimentation. And so all of these elements can kind of come together into the systems approach that's been discussed a couple times. Good institutions kind of sit at the top of this model and carry the burden of adaptation. They interact and co-evolve with the environmental or built sphere, economic system, social system, and by setting the necessary artifactual structure, resilience can kind of grow from this system as an emergent outcome. And we see charter cities as being essential to setting this institutional structure and creating positive feedbacks and the growth of resilience. So I will leave it there. Hopefully that leaves some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Eva. And it's interesting that you, in your final slide, if you could just bring it up again, the last slide before the thank you. I think that's a critical slide to wrap up everybody's presentation because it's what everybody was essentially saying. Previously? No? Okay. That the institutional system and its adaptive capacity affects the absorptive capacity on an environmental, economic, and social sensitivity level. Thanks, Eva. You can stop sharing. I'm going to go into the chat and just springboard from that very briefly in the last 5 minutes on a question posted by Chipulu Lubumbe. And this is a question for Professor Lwasa, but I think it's a question for all of us to think about, and I will pose it to Professor Lwasa, but I will also give an opportunity for all of our participants to respond to this. The question is, how do we harmonize the different competing needs approach as an alternative to previous approaches without disrupting and affecting local economies in relation to outstanding multilateral and bilateral relationships? So this speaks to cities being networks within networks. It speaks to the institutional, absorptive, and adaptive methods that Eva just spoke about. It speaks to the legislative power, and it speaks to the policy challenges and agency that Mr. Phiri spoke about as well. It speaks to the need for trade on the African continental free trade areas implementation, and it speaks to so many different aspects of what we spoke about today. So Prof, I'll hand over to you to give a brief intervention on this, and I will also open it up for anybody that wants to give a 30-minute response. 30-second, not minute, 30-second response to this.
Yeah, thanks, Chipulu, for the great question. Tricky. As I said, I don't have solutions, but I have some thoughts in terms of thinking and shifting how we approach issues. One of the things that I've been working on that I didn't share is the integration. A lot of things that have been talked about here and a lot of what's going on in cities and municipalities is still very much sector-based. We have been working on and testing the integration of the 5 critical systems or subsystems of the city of systems, and that is the blue, green, culture, and gray, and social. So how do you bring those together? A lot of activities as we see them are very much siloed and sector. And to address this harmonization, because the needs are actually very much related to sectors, to address that, you have to find the intersecting points of more than just one of these different elements. And I think the last slide by Eva gives it all. We're working with that model of the economy, social system, and environment is the green, blue, and cultural. And whereas the institutional is the sort of the overarching, which would trigger if there's transformation and change in the institution to allow that. A lot of municipalities and cities are still operating as Department of Public Health, Department of Roads, Department of Drainage, Department of Economic Development. and there's no planning that is strategic enough. I know there's planning, as Njuguna mentioned it, and the pilots they have done, but it is not integrated enough. They still go back and ride through the sector base, but that integration would harmonize, because then you start looking at the intersection points and look for opportunities where one intervention can actually enhance the other different sectors. So you go for infrastructure that is multifaceted and heterogeneous. It does not only provide infrastructure in terms of water and sanitation, but it also creates new jobs. And you start, diversifying from technical people in a utility company to a multiplicity of small to medium enterprises in water and sanitation. That's a possibility of bundling this and bringing that harmonization together. Yeah, back to you, Mandipa.
Thank you. Mr. Phiri, would you like to just shed some light on how these integration and these strategies around what we're speaking about could help, local government be more effective?
Yes, like I presented earlier on the what we call integrated development plans at local level in Zambia, and these are plans that by law each town, city, and indeed a district is supposed to develop. This is exactly meant to ensure that it brings all stakeholders and actors in the development fraternity to one space through this document, and you do deep analysis of issues that could be caused in one sector but having effects in another sector. And so you're able to create synergies and ensuring that the approach is integrated in providing solutions to that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. We have two more questions, but I'm going to merge them into one because I see them as being interlinked. So the first question is from Busiku Chulwe, again in Zambia, who asks, how can governments get out of the development financing trap so that they can push their own priorities and not those pushed by multilateral and bilateral organizations? This speaks to the model of the Charter Cities Institute that Eva presented on. And it also speaks to the question of Claudio Schichter, who is asking a question from Brazil, asking how do we think that special economic zones are special, per se, in a sense of giving different regulations that could help unlock the potential for prosperity in Africa. This speaks to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Ms. Changala, I don't know if you would want to respond to that as well. And on the development trap, Ms. Savadogo, if you have anything to say on that, or if there's a legal framework that you and Habitat would like to push that we need to be lobbying for. Ms. Changala? Oh, Eva, yeah.
Yeah, I can speak briefly to the question on the SEZs. And we were talking earlier about multi-benefit interventions, right? And I think it's really crucial to kind of go as far up the ladder of resilience or as far back end as you can. And again, it comes back to good institutions. And charter cities, special economic zones, kind of, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, lay the groundwork for the subsequent growth of good institutions. And that's a buzzword, right? There are no panaceas. The structure is going to look different depending on context, as it should. But kind of setting the foundations for economic growth, good economic governance, land administration, right? Infrastructure provision. Sometimes it's a capacity constraint or financing constraint. And so mobilizing private entities, public-private partnerships to fill some of those gaps and set cadastre systems, little things like that are upstream to all of these subsequent efforts for resilience. I think that's the big benefit of SEZs and charter cities for sustainable, resilient growth specifically. Of course, there's a whole lot of economic literature on it, but I guess that's my response to the question.
Sorry. Ms. Savadogo, as a mobilizer, how do you see this playing out? And I'll throw it to Ms. Changala to close it up for us.
Yeah, thank you. Also, I think the government should also leverage their own financing, their own resources. And what we do in the African Development Bank, mainly for urban development fund, we have an instrument that called Municipal Access to Finance Window. So this window is to leverage a municipal capability to leverage their own resources. We provide some transaction advisory and also support to scale up the municipal finance so they can have a capability to leverage on the market, on the international market, the resources to finance themselves, the infrastructure. This is also a way to that not be only on under multilateral bank. Also, we have private sector. Private sector is today the main issue for African city to get finance. So, and also at the African Development Bank, we have this private sector window, which we accompany city to build a very partnership between the government and the private sector in order to mobilize resources to deal with lack of resources. Also, for the first question, I will give a few thoughts. We have also what we call Africa City Network as part of a UMDF instrument. And this network is to make some study too between the African city and other special city like Itok. So in order to share lesson learned in terms of better learning on urban aspects. So we did last one in Copenhagen, and this year, no, 2024, we plan to make one in Brazil. So in order to share lesson between what is done, what is the best on result in terms of urban planning resilience, and what African city can capture some information to improve ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Changala.
Yes, so I will start with the first question. What we do at the bank is we engage the regions, the sub-sovereigns, to tell us what their development needs are. We do not prescribe processes. We work with the development plans that they have, for instance, whatever projects that they already have in existence. So most of them, as an example, might have an idea for a special economic zone. And what we do is that we engage them to find out their specific needs. And it'll start from things as we have a facility which we call the Project Preparation Facility. So we can move that project. If it's a special economic zone, for instance, we'll do a feasibility study to make it bankable. And then from there, we then work with the specific sub-sovereign. If, for instance, they would like an investor to come into that special economic zone, we have in the bank department that will look at trying to identify potential investors or equity investors that could invest in that specific special economic zone. And maybe that developer could also do the management. So we engage them and work with them and provide advisory services as well to ensure that the park is as integrated as, basically meets their development needs. And to answer the second question, then to go on, how special are these special economic zones? We see, I think, in the countries where we've worked to develop these special economic zones, we've seen, a change. One's economic zone has the capacity to change the whole outlook of a city, because with it comes, infrastructure, roads, services that are being brought into that special economic zone, and most of them expand, to include residential housing and all kinds of facilities. So it has the potential to change a whole city, from and bring development in that city. So it's we look at that as an opportunity, one, to bring investment into an area, but create the much needed jobs and services that are needed in these local areas, but also the fact that the governments, most of these are usually PPP, so the sub-sovereign would be, especially those that are not as centralized, the ones that are devolved, the sub-sovereign could be a shareholder in that, and that way they have a say on how the city is developed and the special economic zone is developed. But at the end of the day, we also look at it from a holistic point of view. Those special economic zones are also special in the sense that the local people are not only being employed, in that region or city, but also it's creating backward and forward linkages. So, you know, the local people in those areas or cities are able to supply goods and services to that multi-facility economic, the special economic zones that may have been created. So I think it's a very integrated approach, and we see that as an opportunity to support our African regions. The other thing that I should highlight is that as a bank, we also have a pool of investors that we work with. And so we have investors, if there's a city that's looking, for instance, and I'll keep to the example of a special economic zone, we have a pool of investors and people who have experience in this field who we work with and support to develop those special economic zones. The same pool of clients also we have a pool of investors who are looking to invest in Africa and in the African continent. So we will bring the investors in that particular region to explore the opportunities that are available, because part of what we're also trying to do is to increase the capacity of African contractors to be able to deliver projects within Africa. You'll agree with me that a lot of the contracts in Africa are done by Chinese contractors, foreign contractors from Europe. So we also have an initiative which we call the Engineer Procure Initiative, which is aimed at trying to increase the capacity of local contractors to be able to provide construction and infrastructure related services on the continent. So all those various initiatives that we have, basically, we are trying, like I highlighted, to bring them at the local level and see how best that those initiatives can be realized and development brought to the sub-sovereigns.
Absolutely. Thank you. And with your offer to give us all money, I would like to end this webinar. It is very clear that Rome, and clearly as we've discussed, resilience was not built in a day. We don't have the answers, but we definitely have seen that we are starting to think about and implement the solutions in our silos. Ours is to lobby integrated solutions, and I would like to thank everybody for staying 21 minutes over time. I think it was a very rich discussion. I think everybody's voice needed to be heard. Thank you, everybody. Professor Lwasa, for your time. Eva, for your time. Samuel, for your time. Micheline, Mr. Phiri, and Matimba, for your time. Thank you to all our participants that stayed on as well, and our audience. Heba, thank you so much for working behind the scenes. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.